I actually think the Souls games are pretty easy.
NANI?!
I have the power of God and anime on my side!
I'm sorry I said those words before. Okay, yeah, the Souls games are pretty tough, but what about each game really grinds your gears? Let's talk about the hardest part of every Souls game, starting with Demon Souls. The bosses. Just kidding, of course. In my case, there wasn't a boss in the game that killed me more than a few times in my first playthrough. The enemies themselves throughout the level never gave me too much trouble either, other than the odd tank here and there. I'm looking at you, man after the penetrator. Dude penetrated me more than the penetrator. So other than that guy and the red phantom sucky boys in the Tower of Latria, no enemies were really that hard either. So what was the biggest challenge? Definitely the boss runbacks, by far. Some of these runbacks, like to the Tower Knight, could last up to a couple minutes and were filled with dozens of enemies and massive dragon area hazards. And to top it all off, there aren't any midway checkpoints in Demon Souls, meaning one death sends you all the way back to the beginning. Sure, this was compensated for with easier enemies on average and much easier bosses, but there are a few runbacks that killed me more than any boss, and that means every death to a boss could mean 10 more minutes of floundering like a fish up Tower of Latria's asshole. Jesus Christ. Okay, Dark Souls 1. As opposed to Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 has plenty of challenging bosses to test your might, especially ONS and Manus, Father of the Abyss. Might as well call him Manus, Father of my asshole, cause that guy pounded me more times than I care to share. It would be pretty easy to say the DLC, because it takes everything in the base game and ups the ante significantly, but I'm going to have to say the ambiguity of your journey. There are so many times in Dark Souls 1 where things are unclear. With some trial and error, it's not too tough to eventually figure out what to do, but you can easily spend hours lost and confused. Just from the tutorial boss, and I say that lightly because it doesn't really tutorial you much, he jump scares you while you have a broken weapon. I bet there are plenty of players who had no idea about the secret door in the back and tried to brute force their way for hours. Then you have your introduction to Firelink, which explains literally nothing except to ring 2 bells, while providing you many possible paths. On my first playthrough, I didn't even realize that there was a path up the side of the mountain to the Undead Burg until I floundered in the catacombs for about an hour. As much as ONS are challenging, they don't take me over an hour to defeat. This continues throughout the rest of the game, with entire areas guarded with ambiguity. The first time I realized you had to walk on the railings to Anna Rolando to get to the Painted Room, I just about lost it. Then finding your way to Gwendolyn's boss room or the Painted World, or how to undo the curse mechanic, which you can get stuck with for a long ass time. And for as many challenges as there are with the bosses, there are many, many easier bosses that don't really test your gamer creds. Even ONS are a zero death victory usually for me now, as the combat of the later games has brushed me up on my skills. But now it's time for Dark Souls 2, and no beating around the bush. The hardest part of Dark Souls 2 is the groups of mobs in the DLCs. Because your iframes are tied to agility, it can make managing these crowds of enemies just a bit harder unless you port a bunch of levels into the stat. So you add that with the fact that you're just a bit slower in Dark Souls 2, and those two problems alone are enough to compound the multi-enemy fights into a serious problem. I just about smashed my computer more than once when they surround it. Okay, it's actually not that bad for the most part, but there are a few moments, especially in the DLC, that feel like FromSoft is just being unreasonable. Like, what is this? It can't be real. I feel like especially as a melee build, there are times where you're expected to just speed run through an area that's a nearly impossible area. And there are moments where they literally just drop you into dozens of enemies in a relatively small spot and aggro them all at once. And for some reason, interacting doesn't make you fully invincible in this game, so when you try to open doors, you can still die. It's weird. I'm actually kind of a Dark Souls 2 fan, but you wouldn't think it based on how I talk about it on this channel. It's just really every time I make one of these lists, some of those problems really stick out. Maybe it'll be my New Year's resolution, to give Dark Souls 2 more credit. Bloodborne is an interesting case because its most challenging sections are the absolute beginning and the absolute end. It's between the first street and the beginning of the game, or the DLC and Orphan of Kos. In terms of pure challenge, Orphan of Kos is miles harder than the beginning of the game, of course, but as a new player, you're not as well equipped to deal with the speed of combat, the dozens of enemies, and the gruelingly long sections with no lanterns. I suppose because I have played through the games many times, I'll put Orphan of Kos in the DLC, but if I were a new player, I would absolutely be eyeing the streets. Bloodborne actually gets pretty easy in my opinion. There's a super steep learning curve in the beginning, with Gascoigne and the street, but after that, the rest of the game is actually pretty easy. There are many beast bosses that feel telegraphed but fair, the checkpoints are far apart and all, but you can regain health with the rally system. It's a very balanced game, but the DLC spikes in difficulty severely above the base game, and the pinnacle of that challenge is Orphan of Kos. I initially didn't have much of a problem with little old Orphy, but me and him have some beef after he pummeled me 50 times in my last playthrough. Maybe I was a little rusty, or maybe he was a little musty, but either way, that fight was grueling as all hell, and is more than deserving of a spot on this list. When I was an absolute Dark Souls 3 noob, I would have easily answered Abyss Watchers or Soul of Cinder. I know, everyone tells me they're easy, but man, if they didn't take me dozens and dozens and dozens of tries in my first playthrough. While there are definitely peaks of difficulty in the DLC, there isn't anything particularly that stands out to me in Dark Souls 3 as unbelievably challenging compared to the rest. This is one of the more balanced Souls games in my opinion, with a pretty reasonable curve from beginning to end game. There aren't huge groups of enemies too often, the runbacks are relatively short, the bosses are kinda balanced. I guess if you held a gun to my head and forced me to listen to Mongolian throat singing if I didn't give an answer, I'd say that a few of the DLC bosses really do climb up there in difficulty similarly to Bloodborne. In particular, I'm looking at Midir and Frida as primary suspects. They got Mondo-sized health bars that lead to grueling, long fights, with the potential to be 1 or 2 shot depending on your vigor. But they're actually fairly learnable. There isn't anything too unbelievably hard or easy in Dark Souls 3 for that matter, except for maybe the deacons. Over time though, I've learned to overcome these challenges. I remember everyone being certain that the Nameless King was the hardest boss ever, but now he's not too much trouble at all. Well, Sekiro is probably the hardest of all of the games, though you can check out my ranking of the games by difficulty here. On subsequent playthroughs, the game feels a lot easier, but that first run, I mean every single new boss and enemy provided is a serious wall to progress. I felt like I was smashing my head against a brick wall. So what, of all of these challenges, would I put at the pinnacle of Sekiro hardness? The changes to the combat. The subtle differences from the other Souls-likes make it really counterintuitive at first. If you've trained your brain hole to dodge attacks over the years, learning to face tank with deflex is going to be a rough hurdle to get over. It took until Genichiro for me to figure this out, and then it just throws that out with some of the weirder bosses like Demon of Hatred and Guardian Ape and Chained Ogre. There are so many times where I saw an attack incoming and reactively tried to circle the boss, dodge with perfect timing. It was misery. I'm still traumatized. Once you get this down though, the game should click, but with all of the unblockables and grabs and change-ups throughout, the game expects a lot of the player. It's not an experience I would trade for anything, but it definitely grinded my gears until I got a handle of it. Every boss has the unique twist to throw you off, like the previously mentioned ones, or even bosses like Gyobu and Lady Butterfly with their huge mobility. Chained Ogre can still suck my ass. And lastly, it's Elden Ring, and it's the one-shots. Yep, I think do I need to say anything else? This mostly becomes a problem in the late game, where one serious misstep will end in instant death, and it necessitates you locking tons and tons of levels into your health. This covers bosses like Malenia, Malekith, or even Godfrey at times. Pretty much every boss that I would consider easier in Elden Ring is one that just won't destroy you with one mistake, because so many of them are so unforgiving in that late game. I appreciate this design as it forced me to play as though I was a Souls noob again, but it definitely was the biggest challenge of the game. Oh, and this is assuming you're not using Mimic Tier plus 100 with Rivers of Blood plus 1,000 on every boss, which I suppose is a tough ask for many of you, because you all told me how you first timed Malenia. How did you do that, I wonder? Well, but that's okay. I love all Elden Ring players, even the OP build abusers. Seriously, I really don't care what build you use. As long as you're enjoying the game and having a fun time, it's good for you. But anyways, that's my list. Be sure to subscribe for more content, and let me know what you guys think down below. Have a great day, and peace.